What if I told you that a forgotten civilization, one that predates the Roman Empire by over 6,000 years, once held the key to global peace, and that its erasure from history directly paved the way for the bloodiest war mankind had ever seen? Buried beneath layers of ancient mud brick and imperial propaganda lies a truth so shocking, so paradigm-shattering, that mainstream historians still refuse to talk about it. According to recently unearthed inscriptions, this advanced civilization not only pioneered early forms of global governance, it had a diplomatic infrastructure capable of resolving conflict between rival empires on multiple continents. Some even claim their treaties were centuries ahead of the Geneva Conventions. But then, suddenly, they vanished. Not in war, not in collapse, but in deliberate erasure. Now, emerging evidence from Central Asia, the Balkans, and forgotten archives in Vienna suggests this ancient power may have influenced the great European monarchies far more than we ever imagined. And if its secrets had not been buried, there might never have been a World War I at all, because this lost civilization may have been the last hope for peace, and they made sure you'd never know. In the windswept plains of Central Asia, near the dusty fringes of the Kazakh steppe, lies a site so unassuming, so nondescript, that for centuries it was dismissed as nothing more than a natural mound, a relic of glacial movements or wind-blown sediment. But in 2017, a remote sensing survey conducted by a joint team of Kazakh and Czech archaeologists detected something strange beneath the surface, a symmetrical substructure, too regular to be natural. What they uncovered over the following years would not only rewrite the history of human settlement in the region, it would call into question everything we thought we knew about diplomacy, governance, and the rise of modern civilization. Beneath layers of compacted earth and clay, archaeologists discovered the remnants of a sprawling city, not made of wood or simple mud brick, but of intricately fired stone, glazed ceramics, and engraved slate unlike anything from the region's known historical periods. At its center was a circular complex containing concentric chambers, canals, and stones steely etched with symbols that defied categorization. Carbon dating from charcoal fragments taken from inner hearths returned a staggering date range, 6600 to 6200 BC, thousands of years before the earliest known city-states of Mesopotamia. But it wasn't just the age that shocked researchers. It was the content of the symbols. Among the recovered stelae were sequences that bore unmistakable structural parallels to modern diplomatic documents, symmetrical arrangements, repeated characters suggesting standardized agreements, and spatial formatting similar to articles or clauses. A linguistic team from the University of Tübingen noted that several of these inscriptions appeared to define territories, indicate mutual agreements, and establish protocols for dispute resolution. These weren't religious texts or trade tallies. They were something far more advanced, early treaties. The site was given the name Karahan Delta, and despite its significance, mainstream archaeological journals barely mentioned it. Funding was quietly cut. Multiple field leaders received pressure from governmental historical commissions to withhold full publication of findings. Why? Because what Karahan Delta represented was too dangerous for the official timeline. An ancient civilization practicing structured diplomacy 6 millennia before the rise of the United Nations. Among the ruins, artifacts were uncovered that added to the mystery. Obsidian tools from Anatolia, jade fragments from far western China, and crushed lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. This wasn't just an isolated city. It was part of a wide-reaching network that traded, corresponded, and, most shockingly, resolved disputes. Inscriptions on 2 obelisks describe something akin to neutral councils, where emissaries from rival settlements came to resolve border conflicts and settle intergroup trade disagreements. This wasn't just proto-civilization. It was a lost order, one that prioritized negotiation over war, one that believed peace was not the absence of violence, but the product of structured, enforceable diplomacy. A philosophy so alien to the trajectory of empires that followed, it had to be forgotten. And perhaps it was, until a team digging in Bulgaria uncovered stone tablets bearing symbols that matched those at Karahan Delta, over 3,000 kilometers away. And the implications? Nothing short of catastrophic for the current narrative of early human development. Thousands of kilometers to the west, along the shores of the Black Sea in modern-day Bulgaria, sits the ancient necropolis of Varna, a site already famous for yielding the world's oldest known gold artifacts. But in 2021, a lesser-known excavation near the outskirts of the Varna complex unearthed a cluster of stone tablets that would ignite controversy within Europe's archaeological elite. Unlike the ornate gold masks and ceremonial items found decades earlier, these tablets were crude in appearance, flat slate slabs etched with repetitive geometric symbols, grid patterns, and what appeared to be early proto-writing. At first glance, they seemed like abstract ritual pieces. But when images of the symbols reached linguists involved with the Karahan Delta site, alarms were immediately raised. Dozens of the Varna symbols were identical in form, orientation, and even sequence to the diplomatic-style carvings found in Central Asia. Some scholars dismissed the resemblance as coincidence, the product of convergent development. But a deeper analysis conducted using advanced pattern recognition software revealed a statistically impossible overlap. Specific symbols, including what appeared to be analogs for concepts like treaty, border, council, and even penalty, matched not only in form, but also in relational position to each other. These were not abstract icons. These were the building blocks of shared diplomatic lexicon, one that spanned entire continents and had existed thousands of years before the rise of classical writing systems. Even more unsettling was the layout of the Varna tablets. Unlike Mesopotamian cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs, these inscriptions followed a strict quadrant format, divided into 4 sections with mirrored arrangements. Linguists theorized this could indicate bilateral agreements, with the left side detailing one party's responsibilities and the right side the other's. The upper and lower quadrants may have outlined enforcement procedures or contingency clauses. In effect, these were prehistoric peace contracts. The Varna discovery challenged every assumption about Neolithic Europe. It suggested not only that the Balkan region had early exposure to complex political structures, but that it had direct cultural continuity with a civilization once thought to be isolated deep in Central Asia. This raised a critical question. Who were these people who spanned such vast distances? And how do they maintain such remarkably consistent records? Enter a newly discovered tomb at the Varna site, containing the skeleton of a man buried with unusual items, a bronze medallion bearing the same unknown script, a jade ring traced geochemically to Xinjiang, and, most puzzling of all, a scroll made of preserved birch bark protected inside a wax-lined ceramic tube. Though mostly degraded, fragments of the scroll's ink could be deciphered under infrared analysis. The writing seemed to invoke the idea of diplomatic lineage, a priesthood or administrative class responsible for maintaining inter-settlement harmony across regions. But then came a twist. The scroll referenced not Varna nor Karahan, but a third city, one that hadn't yet been located. A central hub of governance and philosophy referred to cryptically as the seat beyond the rivers. When a location of this seat was cross-referenced against trade routes from both Varna and Karahan Delta, a central node emerged, a region that had long been politically sensitive, one controlled by competing empires and largely unexcavated, the Caucasus. And as fate would have it, a dusty archive buried deep in Vienna would soon shed even more light on this missing link. A collection of forgotten imperial letters, diplomatic memos, and one particularly bizarre map, all pointing to a truth that no European power wanted uncovered. Because it wasn't just ancient people who knew about the peacekeepers. The ruling families of Europe may have known too, and deliberately kept it hidden. In the heart of Austria, beneath the polished marble and gilded opulence of Vienna's Hofburg Palace, lies a lesser-known archive, a cold, dimly lit labyrinth of documents stretching back centuries. It is here, among yellowing parchment and forgotten imperial decrees, that a strange bundle of sealed documents was uncovered during a 2022 digitization initiative. The contents were at first ignored, just another collection of obscure 18th century correspondences cataloged under 4 relations, miscellaneous. But one archivist, intrigued by the peculiar watermark on the papers, a circular emblem flanked by 2 rivers, flagged the documents for further examination. That decision would shake the foundations of European historiography. Inside the bundle was a series of letters exchanged between members of the Habsburg court and an enigmatic group referred to only as custodes paces, Latin for keepers of the peace. At first, the references seemed allegorical or religious in nature. But the further researchers delved, the clearer it became. The Habsburgs had been corresponding with a secretive organization claiming descent from a prehistoric diplomatic order, one that traced its lineage not to Rome or Greece, but to a forgotten civilization that once existed in the Caucasus, known only by a cryptic name, Valastra. Among the documents were copies of translated stone inscriptions, diagrams of circular city layouts eerily similar to those found at Karahan Delta, and, most shockingly, a map. Drawn in faded ink and sealed with an unfamiliar crest, the map showed a triangulated network connecting Karahan, Varna, and a central mountainous region labeled Vallis Sanctum. The coordinates aligned with a little-explored region of Georgia's highlands, a place long rumored by local folklore to be home to the Whispering Stones, ancient megaliths that emit tones in high wind. But it was the content of the letters that disturbed researchers most. One passage, dated 1793, read, "The council's wisdom, drawn from the stones and the codes of Valastra, warns against the growing discord in Europe. Without observance of the ancient treaties, the continent will fall to blood and madness before the century turns." This was not prophecy. This was a warning, one sent decades before Napoleon's rise and more than a century before the outbreak of World War I. Even more bizarrely, another letter references a clandestine meeting held in Krakow in 1815, shortly after the Congress of Vienna. According to the document, select monarchs were presented with translated versions of Valastran codes, diplomatic systems designed to prevent large-scale war through binding, rotating peace councils. The system was rejected, deemed too utopian and undermining to sovereign will. The result? The protocols were buried, the custodes paces disbanded, and the knowledge faded back into obscurity. And yet, the trail doesn't end there. Tucked into the last folder was a partially torn document, written in a modern European hand, dated July 1913, barely a year before World War I began. It referenced growing tensions in the Balkans and urged the Kaiser to reconsider the ancient arbitration model. It was marked rejected. Valastra's diplomatic model, a system based not on conquest but consensus, had once again been silenced. But the documents prove something extraordinary, that Europe's ruling elite knew of this ancient order, that they were given a chance, perhaps their last, to return to a forgotten form of governance that valued peace over power. And yet, they chose not to. Still, one mystery remained. Where was Valastra? Where was this hidden civilization that left echoes across the continent, from the steppes of Asia to the courts of Vienna? The answer would come, fittingly, from a ruin few dared to excavate, a place buried not only in earth, but in political tension and religious fear, because the empire that erased Valastra may still be trying to keep it hidden. Deep in the southern Caucasus, nestled within a volatile corridor of mountains and fractured borders, lies the lesser-known archaeological site of Tsakan Gora. Long ignored by mainstream archaeology due to its proximity to contested territories and decades of geopolitical instability, the area has remained largely unexcavated, a no-man's land of myth and silence. But in 2019, a rogue team of Georgian and Armenian researchers, operating without the approval of major institutions, began covert excavations at a stone mound identified by locals as Gvertiskero, the Hill of Voices. What they unearthed would send shockwaves through the underground world of alternative historians. Buried beneath a landslide of volcanic ash and centuries of purposeful destruction, they found the partial remains of what appeared to be a multi-leveled citadel. The outer walls were built in an architectural style that bore uncanny similarities to both Karahan Delta and the Varna complex, but with key differences: vertical integration of crystalline minerals, a unique mortar that resisted erosion, and most bizarrely, a series of underground vaults sealed with massive basalt doors. Inside these vaults were rows upon rows of stone tablets, many smashed deliberately, others stacked in protected alcoves. Their inscriptions were unmistakable, the same symbols, structures, and formats as the diplomatic treaties discovered across Eurasia. This was not a regional outpost. This was the capital, the seat beyond the rivers. This was Valastra. The records recovered from the vaults told a chilling story. Valastra had been the nexus of a continent-spanning system of treaties, councils, and peacekeeping agreements stretching back over 8,000 years. It hosted emissaries from lands as far-flung as the Levant, the Nile Valley, the Indus, and even early Scandinavian settlements. Their system operated on a rotational governance model, rotating councils of elders from each partner region who convened every 8 years to revise treaties, address conflicts, and mediate disputes. War, in Valastra doctrine, was considered a failure of memory, a breakdown of sacred contracts encoded in stone. But Valastra's downfall came not from within. It came from the outside and was intentional. According to several charred inscriptions recovered from Central Archive Chamber, an invading force identified only by a symbol resembling the eagle, one later linked to early Indo-European steppe cultures, waged a prolonged campaign to obliterate the Valastran system. Not conquer, erase. Records indicate that once the city fell, its stone treaties were shattered, its scholars executed, and its underground libraries sealed with earth and fire. The goal wasn't to defeat Valastra, but to remove it from memory. Later cultures, from the Assyrians to the Persians, make cryptic references to a city of stones that spoke, always in the context of punishment or divine anger. Even early Christian texts contain apocryphal stories of a city where men served no king but the stone, wiped out by the wrath of heaven. Valastra had been reduced to myth, its physical location deliberately lost, its ideals replaced with conquest and hierarchy. By the 19th century, European powers, having rediscovered hints of Valastra's system, had every reason to continue its suppression. The idea of a non-imperial, rotational diplomatic order challenged the very foundations of monarchical rule. To accept Valastra's existence would be to admit that peaceful global cooperation wasn't just possible. It had already happened and been destroyed. One final detail chilled the researchers at Sakangura. Etched on a sealed chamber wall was a symbol identical to that found on the Vienna map, the two rivers flanking a circle. Below it, an inscription in the lost Valastran tongue, later translated as, "Bury us if you must." But the stone remembers. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a lost civilization. It was a system, one buried by empires, hidden by governments, and ignored by historians for centuries. But now, the stones were beginning to speak again. And what they whispered next would challenge everything we believe about how wars begin and how they could have been prevented. In a dimly lit corner of Istanbul's Topkapi Palace archives, filed under diplomatic miscellany, lay a peculiar document long overlooked by historians. It was a map, hand-drawn, faded by time, and labeled in a language that had no clear origin. Bound within a forgotten Ottoman record of trade routes and regional pacts, the map bore no names of cities or empires, only a network of concentric paths and junction points. At first glance, it seemed abstract, perhaps ritualistic or astrological in nature. But when superimposed over a modern satellite map of Eurasia, a strange truth emerged. Each node aligned almost perfectly with known locations: Karahan Delta, Varna, Sakangura, and dozens of smaller, still unexcavated sites stretching from the British Isles to the Iranian plateau. It wasn't a map of terrain. It was a map of communication, a forgotten geopolitical network designed to facilitate global coordination and peace. And at its center, marked with a unique symbol of three interlocking spirals, sat the city of Valastra. Scholars who analyzed the geometry of the map noted its strange mathematical precision. The distances between sites formed ratios consistent with the golden mean. The nodal alignments matched not only ancient trade routes, but also ley lines, hypothetical energy paths referenced in numerous cultures. More importantly, the architecture of the network itself mirrored the structural logic of modern digital communication protocols, decentralized, redundant, and fluid. This was no primitive route system. It was an intentional design built to withstand geopolitical disruption, a self-correcting peacekeeping matrix millennia ahead of its time. But if this map held the key to global stability, why was it hidden? The answer came in the margins. Scrawled in Ottoman script, barely legible, were annotations suggesting the map had been offered to the Sublime Porte by foreign envoys in the late 16th century. One note described it as a system for managing the tribes and kingdoms without war. Another warned, to implement this would mean the dissolution of all sultanic authority. According to the annotation, the map was examined, deemed subversive, and locked away indefinitely. But this wasn't the only time the map surfaced. In 1912, a Turkish historian named Kemal Turgan presented a nearly identical version of the map at a European historical symposium in Geneva. His presentation, based on an unpublished manuscript titled The Covenant of Stones, posited that early civilizations once operated under a rotating peace mandate, the very same system later found in Valastran archives. Turgan's thesis was ridiculed, his funding revoked, and his manuscript disappeared. He died in obscurity, but rumors persisted that the manuscript had been acquired by British intelligence and buried in the archives of the Foreign Office. The implications of the map resurfaced again in the 20th century, when members of the newly formed League of Nations reportedly received a secret proposal outlining an ancient model for global diplomacy. Sources later identified the proposal as a sanitized version of the Valastran system: rotational leadership, weighted voting by region, a binding treaty enforced by shared cultural obligations. But the League rejected it, favoring a Western-centric power structure instead. Within 2 decades, the world was at war again. Valastra's map was never just about roads or symbols. It was a blueprint, a political and philosophical infrastructure designed to unite civilizations not through domination, but through codified peace. The map functioned as a living document, an agreement etched into geography itself. And if that agreement had been honored, if even a fragment of its system had been adopted in the early 20th century, the chain reaction of nationalism, secret treaties, and imperial rivalries that triggered World War I might never have occurred. The entire trajectory of the 20th century, 2 world wars, genocides, nuclear escalation, could have been avoided. But instead, the map was ignored, declared unworkable, too idealistic, too ancient. And yet, it survives, passed down in fragments, buried in archives, etched into stone beneath our feet. Because peace, once written into the bones of the earth, is never truly lost, only forgotten. Until now, across the sprawling landscapes of Eurasia, from the wind-swept plateaus of Central Asia to the fog-draped shores of the Black Sea, the fingerprints of a single lost civilization remain etched into stone, buried beneath millennia of war, empire, and ideological suppression. But who were the people of Valastra, the architects of peace in a world obsessed with conquest? And why did nearly every rising empire in recorded history work so hard to erase them? Genetic studies of skeletal remains from Karahan Delta, Varna, and Sakangura have revealed a startling connection. While their material cultures differed slightly, adapted to local geography and available resources, the people buried in these sites shared a strikingly similar genetic profile. Mitochondrial DNA shows a common maternal lineage, not just within each site, but across them all. This implies not merely trade or contact, but shared ancestry, sustained over thousands of years and thousands of kilometers. These were not isolated cultures mimicking each other. They were descendants of a single, ancient superculture, a forgotten federation that once stretched across the heart of the ancient world. Their defining feature was not monumental architecture, military power, or divine kingship, but diplomatic technology. This included more than stone treaties. Artifacts found in Velastran ruins reveal tools of soft power. Ceramic discs encoded with standardized calendar systems, symbol tokens likely used for voting or representation, and even wearable insignias possibly used to denote rank or diplomatic authority. Their social fabric was designed for dialogue, not domination. And this is precisely why they had to disappear. The rise of empire in the Bronze Age, particularly the expansionist policies of Akkad, the Hittites, and later the Persians, marked a decisive break with the Velastran worldview. Centralized power, divine rule, and militarized borders became the new norm. Velastra, with its rotational councils, shared authority, and enforced peace protocols, was an existential threat to emerging imperial ideologies. The memory of a peaceful global system had to be extinguished for tyranny to thrive. The process was systematic. Myths were rewritten. The peacekeepers became cautionary tales of failed pacifists destroyed by their own naivety. In regions once under Velastran influence, new ruling powers co-opted their symbols, transforming the spiral of peace into wheels of war and conquest. Sacred council chambers were converted into temples of absolute monarchs or razed altogether. Even in the classical world, echoes of Velastra flickered, quickly snuffed out. Plato's Atlantis, a mythical society governed by wise laws and punished by the gods for its decline, now appears less like fiction and more like a veiled memory of Velastran collapse. In Eastern traditions, the idea of ancient kings who ruled without war appears sporadically, always dismissed as allegory. But the erasure didn't stop in antiquity. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, several major discoveries hinting at pre-imperial diplomatic systems were quietly removed from academic discourse. Reports from Russian archaeologists working in the Caucasus during the 1880s, detailing unusual stone libraries and concentric city plans, vanished after the Bolshevik Revolution. British and French colonial missions in the Near East routinely dismissed symbolic tablets as ritualistic or proto-literary, despite structural similarities to treaties. The Catholic Church, too, maintained a quiet but aggressive stance against anything suggesting that moral law could exist outside divine scripture, including Velastra's secular ethical systems. Because to acknowledge Velastra would be to acknowledge that humanity had already built peace once and chose, repeatedly, to destroy it. Even today, academic resistance to the idea remains fierce. Scholars who pursue Velastran studies are often relegated to fringe journals, labeled as pseudoscientists or alternative historians. But the evidence has become too overwhelming to ignore. From matching symbols across distant continents, to uniform treaty structures, to the discovery of functional peace councils carved into stone, the reality of Velastra is no longer a matter of belief. It is an archaeological truth. And if that truth had been accepted, if even a portion of its principles had survived into modernity, the world we live in today would be unrecognizably different. Because peace was never an impossible dream. It was a forgotten memory. It began with a gunshot in Sarajevo, but the fuse was centuries old. The outbreak of World War I is often explained as the result of a tangled web of alliances, imperial rivalries, and nationalism run amok. But what if the real cause, the deeper systemic failure, was not political miscalculation, but the erasure of a global peacekeeping system that once worked? Velastra wasn't a utopia. It was a civilization built on the hard-earned understanding that peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of binding obligations, rotating accountability, and shared memory. Their diplomatic model didn't rely on faith in rulers, but on codified cooperation enforced by material systems. Treaties etched into stone, council protocols dictated by celestial calendars, and decision-making networks spread across continents. Had that system endured? Had even fragments of it survived the rise of empires and the advent of modern nation-states? The bloody tide of 20th century warfare may have never come. By 1900, Europe was a pressure cooker of secret deals, colonial ambitions, and rapidly advancing militarization. The various empires believed they were on the brink of unstoppable greatness, while simultaneously building stockpiles of weapons that could level cities. The peace was brittle, performative, held together not by trust or treaty, but by threat and fear. What was missing was exactly what Valastra had perfected: a decentralized, enforced, rotating diplomatic infrastructure that prioritized conflict resolution over posturing. The Valastran system wasn't passive. It preempted escalation. The stone treaties from Karahan Delta and Varna included clauses for multi-party arbitration, emergency councils, and even temporary leadership suspensions for belligerent members. It was a system designed to prevent the very triggers that launched the Great War. The records in Vienna confirm that fragments of Valastran doctrine were still known to a handful of European elites as late as the 19th century. The custodes paces attempted to reintroduce the system through back channels, offering translations and frameworks that could have replaced the brittle alliance web with a robust, ancient structure of peace. But it was dismissed, too radical, too decentralized, too undermining to empire. In 1913, a final effort was made. A quiet proposal, based on Valastran principles, was delivered to senior figures in Berlin, Vienna, and Paris. It suggested emergency diplomatic hubs, rotational leadership conferences, and a networked, multi-continental approach to de-escalation. It was ignored. The old world wanted war. And when the first bombs fell in 1914, it wasn't just millions of lives that were lost. It was the final opportunity to resurrect a forgotten blueprint for peace. The archaeological record shows that Valastra's model worked, not for decades, but for millennia. It connected disparate cultures, diffused regional conflicts, and enforced cooperative norms through physical symbols, rotating authority, and sacred memory. But to survive, it required shared stewardship. It could not coexist with empire. The destruction of Valastra wasn't just the loss of civilization. It was the severing of a lifeline, one that could have guided humanity through its darkest moments with ancient wisdom, rather than modern violence. World War I was not inevitable. It was the result of a choice, or more precisely, the repeated refusal to remember. And now, as we uncover this forgotten civilization, as the stones begin to speak once more, we must ask ourselves, what would our world look like today if we had listened? If peace had been inherited rather than buried? What if Valastra hadn't been destroyed? What if the last true peacekeepers had prevailed? And most hauntingly, what if we are still ignoring their message? We have been taught to believe that war is inevitable, that conflict is woven into the very fabric of human nature. But what if that belief itself is a product of selective memory? A story told by victors who erased an older truth? Valastra was not a myth. It was a memory, fossilized in stone, scattered in forgotten archives, and whispered through the ruins of a world that once knew peace not as a dream, but as a practiced, perfected reality. Across thousands of years and thousands of miles, its symbols, treaties, and councils speak of a civilization that didn't just imagine cooperation. It engineered it. And then it was silenced, not by time or decay, but by power, by empires that feared what Valastra represented. A model of governance that didn't require kings or conquest. A structure that functioned without borders or bombs. A peace that worked because it was embedded into law, language, and landscape itself. If even a sliver of Valastra's system had survived, had been honored by the monarchs and ministers of the 19th century, the carnage of World War I might have never unfolded. Tens of millions might have lived. History might have followed a completely different trajectory. So we must now ask, what else have we forgotten? What other buried truths lie waiting beneath our feet, encoded in stone, hidden in the DNA of lost peoples, erased by the march of empire? And most importantly, If Velastra could do it once, could we do it again? Because if peace was once humanity's default setting, then maybe it still can be. We just have to remember. Subscribe to this channel for more forbidden history, lost civilizations, and the ancient truths they never wanted us to know.